Hey guys, we're back here. We got Coach Sean, I'm Diane Fu over at the Ready State for another Coaches Roundtable. So we're continuing the conversation inspired by a recent conversation we had surrounding the shoulder, instability, and the labrum. Now, we had some comments going, hey, this was really helpful for us. Can you guys address functionality of the hip? And so we've got Sean here about to lead in talking about the hip labrum and some of the dysfunctions we can see as a result of it.
Absolutely. So, coming from the shoulder, the hip is kind of the inverse. So in the shoulder, you have a ball and socket joint that kind of maximizes mobility and as a consequence minimizes stability. And the hip is sort of the opposite. And kind of a model of the hip, if you want to think about it, if you have your femur comes up, takes about a 45-degree turn, and you have your labrum and the articular socket of the hip comes in, you have about a 50% covering, where in the shoulder, it's like a golf ball on a tee. In the hip, that socket is grabbing on and covering that thing. So it's an incredibly stable joint. I think everyone here has hips and shoulders, and you can see your hip doesn't move as much as your shoulder does, but it can handle heavier loads as a result of that. So when we're talking about the labrum of your hip, it does the same thing. It deepens the socket and it creates a cushion for movement. And it comes around, it's kind of the cartilage ring around the socket half of the ball and socket joint. So there's a couple of issues you can have with this. Obviously, you can have a tear in your labrum, and that's one kind of issue. Maybe more commonly is what we think of as a hip impingement. These are kind of known as FAI, or femoral acetabular impingement, is what that stands for. And that just is, technical name for your hip is your femur. Femoral acetabular is the acetabulum. So femoral acetabular joint is the kind of the technical medical terminology name for your hip joint, because we cannot just call it a hip. That's not easy enough.
Side note, I love these conversations with Sean and also Kelly, of course, because I feel like I'm getting, a master's degree education here for free.
We can't ever just call something by its name and make it simple. But so when you hear FAI, you can think of that as hip joint impingement. That's basically what that means. And essentially what that is a consequence of repetitive pinching, where the femur comes in and is contacting some part of the hip joint around the rim there. And so this happens a lot in athletes who rotate and flex, i.e. every athlete, basically. And I think one of the interesting things to feel about this, and some people might be familiar with this feeling without ever having had a name for it, but because your hip is actually very deep inside of your joint, this is not your hip out here. This is your hip down in here, and it's down in the center. So our body doesn't actually have great sensation or localization of sensation inside of the hip. And so the common area of referred pain, if you have any sort of issue going on inside of your hip, is groin pain. So whenever you have pain that kind of runs in this fashion in the groin, the first thought of a clinician is something's going on inside the hip. And again, that could be a labral tear, it could be an impingement. Those are kind of the two top possibilities if you feel that kind of characteristic groin pain.
So just for clarification for the audience that we're speaking with, you say oftentimes the impingement happens when athletes flex and rotate. Now, are we talking about flex and rotate the leg or flex and rotate the trunk? Like which type of rotation?
It happens in both directions, right? So if I'm straight up and down and I'm flexing my leg or rotating my leg, that's my leg rotating on a flexed hip. But more commonly, we're standing and moving the trunk on a fixed leg. So that relationship works from the bottom on the top and the top working over the bottom.
Right. So can we also say that, with the if we're squatting and we don't get basically the thigh bone out of the way, that you're going to jam the tissue up against itself. Would that create some inflammation as well?
100%. This is a very technique-driven thing, and it's like a slow motion car accident. This is not something where you squatted wrong one time and then you have grown all this new bone or torn through a labrum. That can happen in a catastrophe. And I remember an athlete I worked with years ago who was squatting 500 pounds, had, the bar held together by jump stretch bands. They went to rack it and about half the plates fell off one side and half the plates fell off the other side. And that catastrophe ended up with him having a torn labrum. But most of the time this happens just little niggles. It's, like breaking a paper clip, the analogy Kelly's been using forever. That's the kind of injury this is. It takes decades often for that to develop to the degree that it becomes painful.
Okay, that's fantastic. Well, that's not fantastic, but that's great information. So if we were to carry this further into something where the audience here can access, what are some of the solutions that we can implement to start to clear that impingement?
So one of the basic things we want to do is first understand the positions that drive this. Okay, so understanding the provocative position allows you to focus your technique on moving the other way. So the classic test for impingement is hip flexion, hip internal rotation, because we're rotating internally there, and adduction, or kind of bringing it across the midline. So combine that motion is to bring your hip up in this direction, which is why we don't love to squat with our knees coming in, because that's kind of all of those three motions happening together. And usually that's what will be provocative. And even in a non-symptomatic person, that's not a super comfortable position. Like lots of provocative pain tests, even for a person who's not positive for that, it's not like a super comfortable thing to be like, let's jam that hip in there. That's not great. So the first solution is, well, let's introduce the opposite motion as we're trying to unload that tissue or prevent that pain process from continuing. And then the second thing we want to do is make sure that that person has access to the ranges of motion that would allow them to get out of that position. So this is where a little measurement comes in. If this is an inflexible athlete, the best way is to give them more flexibility so they can open up and give them access to better positions. If they're squatting in that kind of narrower or more compact position, just simply because they can't open up, they don't have that rotation or flexion range of motion, then just giving them more range of motion is definitely step one. You also see this in athletes who are hypermobile as well, right? Someone who has more mobility than they can control will sometimes default to these positions where they're creating more of a bony stability instead of more of a muscular stability, because that helps them to feel secure, even if it's not a great long-term plan.
So is that, and then am I correct in saying that that's where our cueing of like, hey, I want you to drive your knees out,
yes,
and the initiation of the squat comes in?
Yeah, so all of the cues that we have for rotation apply at the hip, right? We're thinking a lot of times, when we say knees out or screw your feet into the ground, sometimes we're thinking, okay, we're solving a problem at the arch. Sometimes we're trying to prevent someone from having a knee collapse. But all of that work is actually done up at the hip. So when we say rotate out, that is a hip motion. And what we're trying to do is actually open that hip up. So we talked about this being the provocative position. Well, the opposite is just being able to open up and be more out in this kind of open position. And the open joint position, or the position where there's least contact with the joint, is more a little abducted. So it's out a little bit, it's externally rotated. And then you can go easily into flexion way up into this position. And that looks like good squatting.
That's fantastic. So guys, that is our little hip Q&A with Sean here. If you guys have any other questions, or you like, us to speak about certain topics, go ahead and place a comment in the comment section. We'll check it out, and we'll see you next time at the next Coaches Roundtable.